We saw in Mill two things: a theory of the mind and a methodology. Now, the theory of the mind doesn't come from applying the method he's proposing. The method he's proposing is something that would apply to physics, chemistry, and biology. But even for physiology, he has doubts that this can apply. But in psychology, he has enormous doubts that this method could apply. So his theory of the mind comes from intuition, from observation of himself and observations of others, of themselves. So that branch of Mill's work will end up in Germany, in Fechner and Wundt, in the development of the study of consciousness. And in America, Titchener, a student of Wundt, will bring the study of consciousness to America. But he had the methodology, had an impact in America in another area, in school psychology. And one of the first studies that was influenced by Mill's methodology was a Winch study in 1908, The Transfer of Improvement in Memory in School Children, published in the British Journal of Psychology. Now, this is not perhaps the first study that used Mill's methodology. Some claim that there is a study by Thorndike in 1901, but I read this study and it has very few details to determine whether it was an application of Mill's study. So you are going to see that Winch uses the method of differences that Mill proposed. Now, one thing you need to take into account of Mill's method is he struggles with causality. He wants to find causality, but in his in his 5 methods, he has to say that the method leads to finding the effect or the cause. He cannot be clear about that because the methods don't allow him to provide that. So let's see an example of the application of the method of differences in psychology, on school psychology, and which is interesting because, as I said, Mill's methods were developed having physics and chemistry in mind rather than psychology and applied psychology. So let's go to the study. The research topic was put forward by Winch, saying that the theory advanced today tends towards the opinion that the results of formal training of any kind are not transferable from one field of mental activity to another. So that's the idea, that if you study in an area, you will transfer this, you can use that knowledge or those skills to apply in other areas. In those days, and now, the idea of domain specificity was strong, and Winch thinks that perhaps it's not quite. And he says he developed a study to test that hypothesis. So the research question is the improvement in memory gained through practice in one object of instruction transferred to another subject which hasn't been practiced? And I'm going to give you more details later on. So in the first experiment, he followed a first step that was to divide children into 2 groups called A and B of equal ability as to memory. So that's very, very important. Remembering the method of differences, Mill taught us to create conditions in which some circumstances are the same, and there is only one circumstance that varies, and we see whether the phenomenon that we're interested in occurs or not. So what Winch is doing here is to, at least in memory, we want in this characteristic the participants in this study to be the same. So that's why he does a test in memory in order to separate the participants, which are children, into groups. So that is the characteristic that is the same in the two groups, the memory performance before the test. So then he asked the children, which were girls, to memorize a history text. And then there was a training session or training sessions over a couple of weeks in which the members of Group A practiced memorizing poems for 2 weeks. Those in Group B practiced working sums for 2 weeks. So basically you have here the idea of a control group. So he wants to test whether the practice in memorizing poems helps to memorize something else. That something else is a memory test, but using a history text rather than poetry. So the idea is there a transfer from learning memorization or trying to practice in memorization for poems into memorization of history texts. And so the control group will have the same characteristics. We said that the students will have the same memory capacity or as a group, and they will differ in the training. So the Group A will train in poetry, Group B will do some work in sums. You don't expect that activity will improve performance in the memory of history texts. So that's why it's a control group. Now, here are the results, and the interesting aspect of these studies is one of the first that used these two groups in a psychological study. And so you're going to see that the standards of the presentation of the results wouldn't pass what we expect for even undergraduate students today. So, but we can see how this naivete in the presentation of the results focus our attention on the design of the study. So I explained this table and explain what I mean by the standards of presenting results. So in table 1, Winch presents Group A data and Group B data, and here we've got the initials of the names of the participants. So today we wouldn't put initials here, we would put we de-identify the data and we use numbers. So we've got here a number of students in the Group A, and here some students in the Group B. Group A went through a preliminary history test with a maximum of 98 points, and these are the results. And Group B also had this preliminary history test, and with the same maximum of 98 was the test that was used to separate the students in the groups, and these are the results. So what this study did is to separate the two groups based on these performance in this task. Okay, so then we are going to compare the performance on this final history test. These are the results of the practice, the first practice in poetry and the fourth practice exercise in poetry. Winch wants to show that there was some improvement here, but the real test is whether this group A, that was practicing in memorizing poetry, has a better performance than this test. This group, which didn't do a practice in memorizing poetry, it did a study. It did some arithmetic. So these are the results we want to compare. So look at the presentation of the data. So we've got, first of all, the maximum is 137. So that changed from 98 in the preliminary history test, because the number of words in each test, in this text, is different. So there is a difficulty in comparing these two values because the maximum is different. Perhaps today we will use percentage of correct answers rather than the total. So we have here the values for each of the participants and in the two groups. Now, we've got here a total and here a total again. That's an interesting measure, but we don't tend to provide this measure today. We provide the mean of this group and the mean of that group. These not even means are provided here in this very early days study in comparison between groups. And if you read the article, you'll see that Winch says things like this, that most participants in group A, their performance is better than the matched participant in group B. So you can see that they are ordered by performance in the preliminary history test. So in the matching participants between the two groups, well, in most cases, the group A participant outperforms the group B participant, but there are, I think, two exceptions. So we are going to see how we do this today. We are going to do a much better descriptive statistics, and then we are going to do statistical comparisons. One thing that is interesting is that Winch is providing the whole data in the study, in the paper. And this is a very good feature, which for a very long time disappeared from psychology journal articles. So the measures that we are going to learn in this course are the ones that started to be reported rather than the full data. So this is a good thing that now, recently, in the last 10 years, it has been a move to provide the data so other people can analyze. So in this case, for example, I'm going to use this data to generate a data set and put it in JASP and do some analysis there. Okay, so this is a different way of presenting the data. And Winch thought that this way of presenting the data is much better. Now, it's an interesting way of presenting the data. So what he did is to put the participants in each group in different categories. So one category is full marks. Different categories according to their result, their performance in the preliminary test. So the students who got full marks in group A were 3 children. Then there is a range from 95 to 98. So there were 5 that had those marks. In the range from 19 to 95, there were 4. In the range from 80 to 90, there were 2. And below 80, 3. And in group B, there were 2 in the first category, 7 in the second, 3 in the third, 2 in the fourth, and 3 in the last category. And then what he did is to see what's the average of these 3 participants here and the average of these 5 participants here in the preliminary test. So while you've got the 98 average, 96.4 average, 91.5, 82, 63.6. Now, it's very difficult to know what to do with these, because if you see the preliminary test average for group B, we've got 98 in the first group, which is the same, but then we've got 96 in the second one, which is different, and 91 is different, 85 and 62. So it's not rational why this classification and not something different. And then he shows that in these categories, the performance is better in group A than in group B. So in this category, in the performance in the final test was 133 on average against 131, 130 against 121, 123 versus 111, 113 against 92, and 94 against 87. So in all the categories, the average is the better. But he provided there a very arbitrary way of dividing the 2 groups. So he did a second experiment, and he decided that this way of presenting the data, so it was better than the first one. And so instead of presenting the full data like he did in the first study, then he started presenting the data in this way. So but you're going to see that the idea of the design of the experiment is the same. Group A, Group B. Group A goes through practice, and Group B does practice but in something else. So instead of memorizing, it's doing arithmetic. And then it's a test but in geography. So they want to vary to see whether it was only for history that was the effect of the transfer from poetry to history, or does it apply to other things as well, such as geography? So Winch wants to know whether in geography the same applies as in history, and he finds that the performance in the geography test is in this first category of participants. The average is 98.6 versus 95, then 92 against 90 versus 93, which is lower in Group A than in Group B. But then 94.6, much higher than in the previous group, versus 85, and then 81 versus 61. So it looks like there is an improvement, but what is missing here is the inferential statistics that we do very easily nowadays. And in table 4, there is another test, another experiment which replicates the first one. The idea is the same, 2 groups, and the final test is a history test as well. So we've got here the average in these categories: 104 versus 100, 77 against 64, and 64 against 46, and 64 against 41. And again, we don't have inferential statistics. But this is the what I wanted to show, that in these early days there was this idea that comes from Mill's method of differences applied to psychology, or applied psychology, in specifically school psychology, and that started to be very popular in America, to do this type of studies. And there is an attempt to have a control group, which is a very important feature of the study. You see some limitations in the way of presenting the data. There are limitations on use of inferential data. Are the differences that we are finding between groups just by chance that we got something due to the way we allocated participants to groups, not because of the different training, or it has to do with the training? That's why we need to use inferential statistics and not just descriptive statistics. The decisions in terms of how to present the descriptives is also interesting, not what we do today. But there is something that is very interesting and a good feature of this study, which is today what we do is to allocate participants to groups randomly, which is obviously a good idea. But in this case, Winch did a previous test to make sure that the participants have the same ability in memory before starting the test, before starting the training. And that's something that is sometimes done, sometimes not done, because the idea is that with randomization, we get that equality in the two groups. Now, the issue is that randomization works when we've got a large sample. So if you have a large sample of participants and you do randomization, so you allocate participants to different groups in a random fashion, then if the samples are large enough, you make sure you will more likely we have very similar samples. So because in this case the sample is not very large, then Winch does this, which is a good feature, to try to make sure, at least in memory, they are the same. So, conclusion of the study: improvement gained by practice in memorizing one subject of instruction is transferred to memory work in other subjects whose nature is certainly diverse from that in which the improvement was gained. That has to do with that he used history and geography. This at least is true as far as children of these ages and attainments are concerned. I expressly add this limitation as to age, says Winch, for inferences from adult psychology to child psychology and to pedagogical practice are extremely unsafe. And I am anxious to avoid the opposite error. So he's saying something very important in psychological research. The results apply to children. We cannot generalize these to adults. And he's saying something that is important to contextualize things. Apparently in those days there were this idea of using adult psychology to try to explain child behavior or child mental processes. And he's saying this shouldn't be done. But I don't want to do the opposite. I don't want to use a study with children to make generalizations to the adult population. So he's very, very nicely indicating that there is whatever conclusion he's drawing here applies only to children of the ages that were studied in this particular study.